What does it take to make workshops work? And how can we facilitate collaboration that sticks and leads to results? My name is Miriam Hartmas, and with the Workshops Work podcast, I'm on the mission to find the magic ingredients that make workshops work. Today is another special episode, as it's a live recording of a forum discussion between Lily Gros, Oscar Trimboli, and moderated by Michelle Howard. It's about presence and what it means in facilitation in all its aspects. So stay tuned. And by the way, if you don't have pen and paper at hand to take your own notes, scroll down to the show notes to download my free one-page summary. And now lean back and get inspired.
Very, very welcome to everybody for this session that is slightly different and still wonderful. For those of you who haven't been part of a forum before, the Seedlings forums have been running every month as a complement to our workshop process, where we invite guests, and I'll do a little drum roll, Lily and Oscar, to share their learnings on the topic, which of course today is presence. And so when we sat to plan this session, we talked a little bit about how we thought it would be nice to introduce the session with a question around presence. And the question that we come up with is, how are you showing up? How is your presence present with us today?
I feel my presence is warm and on a temperature scale, because it is very warm in my room. So I feel my body is a bit tired, but still present. And my mind is very focused and very grateful to be here.
And I'm checking in after a 9-year-old granddaughter's birthday party, and I feel like very, very fizzy Coca-Cola and bring lots of energy across from mostly girls who were screaming at each other after they loaded up with sugar from the birthday cake and then were demanded ice cream. So those two sugar combinations definitely created a very, very interesting experience for the parents who were picking up the grandchildren. For me, my role was cleaning up the wrapping on the paper, making sure that we left the venue in the same state we got it in. And I think that's exactly like facilitation.
And I am present with curiosity of what there is to emerge, learning with and from. And excited to have Oscar, Lily, and Michelle, 3 previous podcast guests. And we all touched upon the topic of presence and listening and authenticity in our conversations. So having this now combined in one space, there can be only magic and inspiration emerging from that.
Well, I am present with some playfulness after what we've experienced in the last couple of hours. I feel like the corks popped. So maybe that's the effervescence of the Coca-Cola too. Oscar. A sense of playfulness and also a sense of gratitude for both the Seedlings program as a whole, but also for this particular session and gathering of people. I'm really excited about the conversation. When we were picking guests for each of these different forums, in fact, Oscar and Lily, I think we locked you in as some of the first, knowing your emphasis on the being aspect of facilitation. So I'm really grateful that you have agreed to be part of the conversation. The way that we shape these sessions is it's a conversation, as I said. We've thought through some questions that we're going to explore, and then we like to have some pause points where we can open it up and have everybody participate, ponder, be curious, whatever it is that you would like to do to explore the topic in your own way. So we've got some clusters of questions and then some pause points. And so I guess the invitation is for some listening and then some participation as part of the flow over the next hour and a half or so. One of the things that we have explored in each of these sessions is to get to know a little bit more about the journey of the different facilitators who are part of the Never Done Before community. And Lily and Oscar, I think that applies to you as well. There's a real curiosity about your journey to facilitation. What brought you to call yourself a facilitator? And when did you decide you were a facilitator? So we've got France and Australia. And maybe, Lily, would you be happy to start? I'll let Oscar's sugar settle. Would you be happy to start, Lily?
Sure. I will be the crisps and appetizers, whether that happened in the birthday or not. So I'm Lily. I'm 31 years old, and I started my journey as a facilitator without knowing that I was doing facilitation. And this is a common point I see in many, many facilitators. And I started in an NGO where we worked with young social entrepreneurs. So the seedlings of social enterprise and of how can we change the world through common projects and common enterprise. And we did many workshops, many seminars for groups of 2 or 3 students to groups of 200, 300 students. And this is where I started. And I think the beginning of my journey was something that was very enthusiasm oriented. So we had to get people motivated, students excited about doing their projects, about going forth in their projects, and also this idea of helping them see the impact that they could have in their territories. And I think I developed that my facilitation style as something that was very action oriented. So let's do a project, let's change the world, let's move. And a few years after, I think I was a bit tired of doing a lot and always orienting my facilitation on action. And I started calling myself a facilitator, I think maybe 5 years ago, when a colleague of mine I was still inside this company. She got trained in facilitation and she started bringing all of these new questions inside the organization. Why are we doing this workshop? What's the objective? What's the intention? Why this? Why that? What's the purpose? And I really liked it. And she mentored me and a lot of other people in the organization. And since then, I've been calling myself a facilitator. And now I've been freelancing for the last 3 years and exploring how we facilitate with the mind. So still keeping this idea of action orientation and doing projects, but also how can we facilitate with the heart, with emotions, and with the body, so that we are not always doing and creating things, but also having this space to be and to be in relationship with oneself, with the others, and the planet and nature.
Wow. Thank you. Oscar.
Well, the good news and the bad news is I don't call myself a facilitator. I think we need to be careful with the identities we adopt and what those identities mean for us and for others. If somebody wants to buy my services and they have to put it on a budget line called facilitation, yeah, knock yourself out. But I think facilitation is a state of mind. You're facilitating an outcome for a group of people, with a group of people, and serving a group of people who are outside the context in which the workshop takes place, the change takes place that you're helping to facilitate. So for me, I've been the victim of many poor facilitators who, the crazy person with, has to write down everything with their magic marker all the time and trying to create an energy that matches theirs rather than meeting the group where it's at, noticing what is present in the room, and then helping the group to notice what progress means in that moment. I think for me, I've equally been gifted many great facilitators as well. And I think for me, one of the interesting times was we'd invested an enormous amount of time in a very big change that I was doing while I was in a corporate role. And we had 14,000 organizations representing over 300,000 employees. that we were going to impact with the change that we were going to do with the technology we were rolling out. And the facilitator took me aside at the break and said, there is absolutely no way we're going to get to the agenda outcomes that your group has agreed to in this room in the first session. I said, great, Alan, no problem. What do you suggest we do? He goes, oh, well, that wasn't the response I was anticipating. I was expecting you to get really angry and drive the agenda. Or I said, well, if we're here to facilitate what's in the room right now, what are you noticing? And what can we achieve in the time remaining? Because I don't think both of us can answer that question. The answer's in the room. And he just gave me a hug and he said, you should be a facilitator. And I said, I've got 14,000 organisations. I've got to roll this change out. If facilitation is how I'm going to get there, Alan, I'm really grateful. But this group of people, which was 80 people in the room at the time, we're in this big hotel. These people are trusting your process, and I'm trusting your process. So let's just trust your process and get through it. And Alan had the courage to tell me the truth at the break. And I learned a valuable lesson about facilitation in that moment, to have the courage at the presence, have the conviction to take the host, the sponsor, whatever phrase you want to use, aside and say, we need to change. And I think for me, in that moment where I saw Alan ask those questions, I saw great facilitation in action.
It's interesting, isn't it, that, and Lily, you talked about the being aspect, and you both referred to that, the notion of our being, of our presence, of how we show up, being as, if not more important than what we actually do. So I'm really interested, from your point of view, how does that balance show up for you between the being and the doing? What degree of emphasis do you put on those different aspects of your work with groups? I won't even use the term facilitation. There you go, Oscar. Your work with groups.
For me, it's a big question, and I think the answer changes all of the time, depending on the group, depending on the agenda, depending on how the session is going. I think it also changes on whether I'm co-facilitating or I'm facilitating alone. I feel that when I'm facilitating alone, I tend to shift between roles. So I will be, at one point, I will be very focused on the agenda, on what we're doing and driving the group. And I will have these mini moments where I stop, take a break, pause, and turn my senses back on. It's like maybe Oscar, you have another way of doing with groups, but I feel like when I'm very focused on a specific activity, I do not have all of the other senses opened up at 100%. I might feel or sense other things that are happening in the group, but I feel like I cannot both at the same time be very focused on the work that I'm doing and be 100% present on the other topics. And one thing that really helps me navigate between those two polarities, I don't think it's two different things, but it's rather polarities and ands rather than ors. And what really helps me is taking breaks and having discussion partners, like what you were saying with Alan, Oscar, having people that I can refer to and help me shift from one polarity to another.
Lily, how does that play out differently face-to-face versus via video and online?
It's a great question. I feel when I'm in the same room as people, as I can sense more things. I can sense the body languages of people. I will see their legs. I can see, the mini movements of what's happening inside the body of people. I can see also the interactions between people and that is quite hard to see it online. People cannot look in the eyes of each other and, have all of these strange little mimics and jokes and things. And I feel I can sense more when I'm in person. And at the same time, I it's very easy to sense also in a digital context whether people are here or not. You can see, the eyes going from left to right and people opening other tabs and things. So it's different senses for me are activated. I don't know if that answers your question, Oscar.
Doesn't need to be an answer. I guess just to raise everyone's consciousness that whether it's face-to-face or virtual, your consciousness as the person in the room, hosting, leading, facilitating. One thing I am very deliberate about whenever I'm inviting conversation, whether that's face-to-face or I mimic this in my mind virtually, when I'm in a room and the group is in some formation, I'm very deliberate to not be in the line of conversation. So I'm always outside the line of conversation, almost out of sight. And sometimes I feel like the sheepdog around the outside of sheep, because people will naturally kind of try and articulate something to me, and I'll always say, please address the group because I'm not going to be here tomorrow. And being conscious to sense that my presence is required, but not my body in between the conversation, and be very, very, very conscious of that. And although you can't mimic it in a video sense, I do adopt that mindset that I never go into a breakout group, because in a virtual context, hosts will often say to me, oh, Oscar, please go into this group because we've got a recalcitrant executive, or, you'd be good for them. And I'd go, for what purpose? Because that intervention is all about you and it's not about the group. So I think reminding myself consistently and having the consciousness to go, I'm facilitating a system, I'm not facilitating the current dialogue, is one of the things that helps me become present to what's happened, what's emerging, and what's useful for the group. I think one of the things I'm always conscious of with hosts is they don't do enough of what I would call the funeral exercise at the beginning of any change, where they acknowledge what's got them to this point, be grateful for it, allow the group to mourn what they've got up to now before they change. And to me, it's always fascinating, the groups where I provide that invitation to all groups. I don't call it the funeral exercise for them. I say you need to acknowledge what's got us here today, and we also need to agree what we're going to leave behind and what we're going to take forward. And I can almost guess sometimes the groups that will take it up wholeheartedly and bring all of their baggage to the conversation, all of the stuff that is holding them back. And then it's equally interesting with the groups that want to go forward but not acknowledge what could possibly be holding them back. And I think often it's the sensing you do. For me, it's with my body. It's not hearing, it's not seeing, it's just a sense. And for the last 3 years, I've tried to tune myself not to go, it can't be done on video, but how do I adapt my presence to video in that regard? So that, Lily, that's why I was curious to ask you that question. Maybe as a skilled practitioner, you could provide another perspective for me as opposed to a correct answer.
Can I jump in there? Because I think you've both talked about what you've learnt from others, and you both mentioned people who have sort of supported you to deepen your practice. I'm really interested in that notion that, we train facilitators in all sorts of tools and techniques, and then people walk away with this kit bag of stuff to do. And yet this notion of how we show up, how we are present, who we are when we're in the room is way less tangible and more challenging to get people into, to work with. how do we cultivate our being? How do we cultivate our presence so that that is an equal, if not even stronger part of our facilitation toolkit than the techniques and, the processes and the things that we use? So how do we cultivate being, presence?
There's probably a couple of things for me. Number one, and no, it's my body. It's not just my mind. So it means I have to sleep. I need to be hydrated. I need to be fully relaxed and available to the group. I'll draw an interesting parallel. In 2 weeks' time, I have to read my third book as an audio book, and I'm using a producer that's done many of these, and they're overseas. And I said, look, I'm available from 6 a.m. to read. So I literally read into a mic, and they're there listening to you as the audience here. What Stephen said to me was, I can't have you at 6 a.m. It takes 2 full hours for your vocal cords to warm up, Oscar. 8 o'clock's the earliest I will see you. It's the earliest I will hear you. It's the earliest I'll record, because he was treating my body as a complete system. And in my head, I do podcast interviews at 4 a.m. Sydney time to New York. No problem. I do workshops to Colorado at 1 a.m. in the morning. Why should this be any different? But it was Stephen pointing out to me and saying, I love your enthusiasm, but we have to do 8 sessions of 2 hours each, and I need to look after your whole body, including your vocal cords, Oscar. So let's listen to our body. So it won't be uncommon for me to make sure that whatever the workshop is, I have a complete 8 hours of sleep. Now, is this possible all the time? No, but it's my mindset, because if I'm in service of the group, I need to be as present and aware as possible. And there's always water present. And for me, it's a state of mind about, I can't listen with all my senses. I can't be available to the group with all my senses, whether it's video or face-to-face, unless I've slept, unless I hydrate, and unless I eat properly. Now, the good news and the bad news is I've never smoked, I've never drunk alcohol, and I'm a vegetarian. So, my lifestyle choices kind of limit the craziness to a 9-year-old's granddaughter's birthday party and lots of sugar. That's about as close as I'll get to the edge of my body. So for me, it's about my body and making sure that I'm present in my body. I remember interviewing Eric Arsenault, who's one of the top voice coaches in the United States for the TV program The Voice. And I interviewed him about the fact that your voice is often the signal to your presence. But he said, most people are in their body, but they either don't know how to use it or they abuse it. And he said there's a very small part of the world, that's about 5%, that respects their body and their body respects them, and they're able to be fully present to amazing connections. And in that context, it was about the singing, the music, and the audience all coming together. But for me, it's my body.
Oh, Lily, I just want to thank you. It reminds me, Oscar, of we used to, and I still sometimes do, talk about grounding ourselves. People familiar with that term of actually, and that is about making sure that you are fully in your body and that you haven't left your thinking brain in the car because you couldn't get a car park, or, all the things that can go on that disconnect us from that sense of being grounded. So that's also, I think that's a really interesting reminder about presence being about being fully actually, embodied. Thank you. Lily, what's your take on how we cultivate being?
Many things are similar to what Oscar, who has disappeared in the dark, just shared. And one very practical thing for me is getting better at knowing myself and what helps me be present and what gets me out of my presence. So, for instance, I've noticed that if I take the traditional French breakfast that they do in facilitation, which is very greasy, very chocolatey, very sugary, then an hour after, I am not there at all. I am hungry. I'm not focused at all. So I pay a lot of attention to what I eat. And I have this rule of no sugar before 4 in the afternoon when I facilitate, and no desserts, because if I do this, I know my body will switch at one point and that it will be very hard for me to focus back. And one thing that also really helps me is taking care of the transitions. So taking care of how I get to the venue, of sleeping the night before at the venue if I can, just to have this transition between I'm at home, I have my daily life, all of my daily preoccupations, and then I start to shift into I'm here to be totally present with the group, and shifting spaces really helps. And when I do this at home is having this invitation for myself to, when I do a workshop at home, have 15 minutes, come into the room 15 minutes before and know that my dog is taken care of, that no one will come and interrupt me in the room, that I have some water, that my space is as clean as I can have it, and that I have had the chance to stretch, to maybe dance to music, to get into my body, and that everything that I needed taken care of is taken care of before. So if that means sometimes that I have to wake up a bit earlier than what I had in mind so that I can evacuate what's in my mind, that will really help me. And another thing that's been helping me in the last years is being more mindful of my defense system and all of these little signals that my body starts lighting up to show me that I'm getting defensive. For example, when I become suddenly very tired, it's that a defense is being activated. So I've started being more mindful of these and starting to observe myself into what are all of these little signals. And then I know when this behavior is happening, I know it's a defense. I know I'm not present anymore. And then I'm starting to tell myself some stories about what's happening in the workshop rather than listening to what's really happening.
You remind me of this notion of, a power of self-observation. So as well as being in our own bodies, we're also observing ourselves, and it's that kind of bearing witness. I don't know whether people have heard that term, but we're in ourselves, so the embodiment that Oscar's talking about, and then that power of bearing witness to ourselves as well. And being able to have both of those lenses at the same time. Yeah.
And maybe just a point on that, for me, that observation role is very tricky because it can shift into the narrator who tells a lot of stories and starts judging or telling a narrative of what's actually happening. And this is where I try to observe just on a bodily level, what's in my body, what's happening in my body, rather than what do I think is happening right now, which can be very interesting, but that can disconnect me from what's really happening.
Wow. Thank you. I'm wondering how this is landing for other people, this conversation about cultivating presence. How is it landing for you? What questions are coming up, ponderings, curiosities?
Miriam with a J. This reminds me of some things that we've spoken about with regard to movement and improv. And when we were talking about, how do we cultivate our presence? Yeah, Lily, you're totally right. It's so easy to slip beyond observation into judgment, and it happens so fast. So that's still working on that. One thing that I and Michelle and I have talked about this too, is with regard to when we do get triggered by something, I do try to do the sort of presence awareness that I preach in a workshop for myself, if I can sneak in just a moment of it when I'm facilitating something to get myself grounded and then back in the space again. And part of that is the physical aspect of things. So being aware of what's in my body, but then also if I can turn that energy into something physical in a workshop, offline especially, but then also online, it gets me back into my body. And then ideally, if I can invite people into a movement as well, then I feel like that's a way to get everybody back in this sort of presence of mind and in the moment. So that's something that I've been working on, and sometimes it works better than others, depending on what energy I put into the room, often. Yeah, that's how it lands with me. Very well, very relevant.
To me, it's making a lot of sense, indeed, also from the improvisation and the dance perspective. I think my challenge would be to create a space for it, to, grant myself the space to reconnect to myself in case I get triggered or disconnected somehow. So I'm wondering, like Kate says, like maybe inviting to a movement, something, what approaches are to do this in a sort of a natural way, creating the space for that.
Thoughts on that, Oscar, Lily? Thoughts on creating that space for recentering, refocusing?
Do you have something that pops up in your mind, Oscar? Or in your body?
I would say, for me, my consistent practice is to ensure the group has an opportunity to reflect on not what they've got as an outcome within a specific subset of the agenda, but ask them to reflect on how they had that dialogue. So they will talk about how they were dialoguing, what they discussed, what they didn't discuss, what was present, what was absent. And I do this so I can just let them go, so I can get to that point of noticing myself, to create the space for me in that moment. Because whether we like the label or not, we are performing for the group. We are bringing our human energy to a performance that is a unique combination of people in place and space and time. And for me, if I don't have those commercial breaks, for me, I can't help them. So I'm very deliberate that maximum every 45 minutes within a day workshop. And if it's a 2-hour workshop, I'll ask this question at least twice. What did you notice about how this conversation just took place? So for me, that just creates space for me then to go, okay. And I can notice what they noticed as well, but I'm not there. I'm back a little bit further while they're in the dialogue, not about their content, but about how they're having the conversation. So that's how I create the space for me to get a bit of a commercial break, to get often I visualize it as just plugging the charger into a phone and just recharging the batteries for a short period of time.
Miriam, I think this reminds me of, we spoke earlier today about silence and breath too. And it's reminding me of how we use those, the kind of pause point that you're talking about, Oscar, a pause point with the group, and also support them to experience their own embodiment. There can be a lot of busyness, a lot of doing, a lot of work happening. And how do we actually ground that for the group as well? I don't know whether you wanted to bring up your little comment earlier on about silence.
As another way to see it also, because I really do love silence, and I also find that at moments the group might need to just have a 15-minute conversation where they talk about what they want to talk and just let their energy flow, and not, because I've been, and I find this very funny in many retreats, there's this kind of atmosphere of always being very dignified, and always when there's a bit too much of emotion, let's ring a bell and center ourselves and ground ourselves. And it works very well in retreats. But sometimes in corporate settings, people just want to talk and people just want to engage in conversations. And sometimes I find it useful, like we were discussing, how do you deal with this with kids? Sometimes it might be 5 minutes of just running around like crazy and yelling like crazy, and then the energy can go down, and then we can recenter and reground the group. And I really try to listen to what the group really needs at that moment. And do I want to guide a grounding exercise because I need to feel grounded and I need to have silence and I need this break? Or is it something that the group really doesn't need? And then how can I design so that both I have my break times, like Oscar, you were saying, and also how can the group explore their level of energy at that point? And I know the times where I've made errors is that I'm not listening to the level of energy and I'm bringing a very different polarity and energy that the group doesn't need at that moment. And there's no transition whatsoever in between. And then the group doesn't understand what's happening. I would be curious to, if I may ask you, Oscar, to your opinion about this. Do you think you have a role in not leading the energy, but in creating these different waves of energy in the group, of being more hyped or more calm, more grounded, more energetic? Do you think you have a role in this?
It depends. Don't we hate that answer? So my role is to hold a process, and if I am in the content, then I'm not serving the group as a system, and I sense the energy of the group is merely their content. It's embodied differently, it's expressed differently, but it's still their content. So for me, I'm not noticing the individual parts of that. I'm noticing how's that influencing the system present in front of me, the group, not necessarily the individuals. So my job isn't to dial in or out of sensing the energy for them, but for the group. So for me, I'm very conscious of, if I hold the process, and the process isn't the agenda, for me, the agenda should be their agenda in that moment, not the agenda they started with or where it is right now, but where they need to go. Then that energy that's emerging is just another content signal. It's just another data point. And if I dial in too hard into that, I don't serve the group, the organic system that stands in front of me. And in video environments, there's actually, to me, more evidence sometimes than it is in group face-to-face environments. You talked, Lily, about the feet kind of agitated under the bottom of the table or something like that. But for me, I'm always conscious to go, okay, what's the entirety of gallery view showing to me? And for me, the simplest thing is the ratio of cameras on to cameras off. So to me, I don't attach a label to each individual box. What I'm looking at is the gallery.
Hello, listener. Are you tired of listening to my podcast voice praising our sponsor Session Lab in each episode? I think it's time to pass the mic over to you. So if you are as much of a Session Lab fan and user as I am, please share your experience and praise, and don't be shy of add a sentence of self-promo. Send me your soundbite and you might hear yourself on the next show and find your name and URL in the show notes. I'm looking forward to hearing from you.